I am Alma Herrera Mountain, and if I had to pinpoint the exact second my life fractured into two distinct realities, it would be the humid Tuesday morning of my 13th birthday. Most people expect childhood trauma to arrive with the sound of shattering glass or screaming voices, but my erasure was silent, bureaucratic, and devastatingly casual. It happened in a suburban kitchen that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale coffee, where the only evidence of my family's departure was a neon yellow sticky note adhered to the stainless steel refrigerator. It was the kind of note you might leave to remind someone to buy milk or take out the trash, not to inform a child that they had been discarded. The handwriting was my mother's, elegant and looping, a script that had always looked beautiful on PTA sign-up sheets, but now read like a death sentence for my childhood. It simply instructed me to stay at a friend's house and claimed they would be back in a week, followed by a generic sign-off of love that felt as hollow as the empty house around me. There was no signature, no emergency number, and no explanation for why the driveway was empty. To understand why I stood there paralysed, staring at that yellow square of paper until the words blurred, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Mountain family. I was the middle child, a position that usually implies being a bridge or a peacemaker, but in my house, it meant I was part of the drywall. My older sister Jasmine was the undisputed star, a collector of varsity letters and academic accolades that my parents displayed on the mantel like holy relics. My younger sister Lily was the cherished baby, a whirlwind of dance recitals and colour-coordinated birthday parties that required months of planning. And then there was me, Alma. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need attention, which the adults in my life conveniently translated to mean I didn't exist. I had spent 13 years perfecting the art of blending into the background, believing that if I caused zero friction, I would eventually be rewarded with love. Standing in that silent kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I realised that my invisibility had finally become absolute. They had not just overlooked me, they had actively planned a vacation to Florida, packed their suitcases, loaded the car, and driven away without once thinking that I might want to come along, or at the very least, that I needed to be told to my face. The first 24 hours were a strange, fugue state of denial and pathetic optimism. I sat on the front porch with my backpack balanced on my bruised knees, convinced that at any moment the station wagon would come screeching back around the corner. I told myself they had forgotten something essential, like passports or sunscreen, and in that panic they would realise they had also forgotten their middle daughter. I watched the streetlights flicker on, buzzing with the electricity of a summer evening, while the neighbour's dog barked at me as if I were an intruder on my own property. I went back inside only when the mosquitoes became unbearable, heating up a frozen burrito I didn't even like, pretending the mechanical whir of the microwave was conversation. I slept in my clothes on top of my bed covers, afraid to get comfortable, afraid that if I fell asleep, I would miss the sound of the front door opening. But the door never opened. The silence of the house grew heavier, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. By the second day, the denial began to crack, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that whispered a terrible truth I wasn't ready to acknowledge. By day 4, the reality of my situation had settled into my bones, heavy and aching. I had checked social media, a mistake that tore open my chest and scooped out whatever hope was left. Jasmine had uploaded a vibrant selfie featuring her pink designer suitcase and a caption about much-needed family bonding time. Lily followed up with a stream of palm tree emojis and videos of them splashing in a hotel pool that looked bluer than the sky. I was nowhere in the frame, nowhere in the captions, and nowhere in the comments. It was as if I had been digitally cropped out of the family portrait. I ran out of fresh food and started eating dry cereal by the handful, pacing the hallway, terrified that the neighbours would call social services if they saw me alone, but equally terrified of starving. The house, usually so full of my sister's noise, was now a mausoleum. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and saw a ghost, pale and wide-eyed, wearing a shirt that hadn't been washed in 3 days. I realized then that hunger wasn't just a physical sensation. It was an emotional state, a hollowness that expanded until it consumed everything else. 6 days into my abandonment, I could no longer stand the oppressive quiet of the house. I walked to the public library, seeking the air conditioning and the comforting smell of old paper, carrying a stack of books like a shield against the world. The heat outside was suffocating, shimmering off the asphalt in waves that distorted the horizon. I sat in the back corner of the library until closing time, reading the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a single word. When the librarian finally shooed me out, I began the long trudge home, my stomach cramping with a hunger that made my hands shake. That was when the car appeared. It was a glossy black sedan, sleek and predatory, sliding up to the curb with a purr of an engine that cost more than my parents' entire house. The window rolled down with a smooth electronic hum, revealing a face I only half recognized from dusty photo albums. It was Uncle Richard, the relative my mother always dismissed as arrogant and selfish, the one who had stopped coming to holiday dinners before I was old enough to learn multiplication tables. Uncle Richard looked at me with an expression that was impossible to read behind his dark sunglasses. He took in my dishevelled appearance, the sweat-matted hair sticking to my forehead, and the defensive posture I had adopted. He asked me in a low, controlled voice why I was walking alone on the side of the road at dusk. I tried to formulate a lie, something about walking home from a friend's house, but my voice betrayed me, cracking under the weight of the last week. I told him my parents were in Florida. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. He repeated the location, his voice devoid of surprise but heavy with something else, perhaps anger. Perhaps confirmation of a suspicion he had held for years. He asked where I was staying, and when I couldn't answer, he cursed softly under his breath. He didn't ask for permission or offer a negotiation. He simply unlocked the passenger door and commanded me to get in, stating firmly that I was not walking another step tonight. The scent of the car interior hit me the moment I slid onto the leather seat. It smelled of expensive cologne, crisp air conditioning, and safety. He drove us to a diner that looked like a relic from the 50s, with cracked red vinyl booths and a glass display case filled with pies that seemed too perfect to be real. I sat across from him, my hands tucked between my knees to stop them from trembling. He didn't bombard me with questions or force me to explain the humiliation of my abandonment. Instead, he ordered a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake for me and a black coffee for himself. When the food arrived, I stared at it for a long moment, afraid that if I blinked, it would vanish like a mirage. Uncle Richard gestured for me to eat, his voice gentle for the first time. I ate with a ferocity that embarrassed me, wiping grease from my chin, while he watched with a gaze that felt like it was cataloguing every injury my soul had sustained. He asked me about school, about what subjects I liked, about anything other than the empty house waiting for me. I told him I liked history because you could analyse the past to understand the present. He smiled then, a small quirk of his lips, and said that was a very perceptive observation for a 13-year-old. After the meal, he drove me back to my street, but he didn't pull into the driveway. He idled the car in front of the dark, silent house and told me to run inside and pack a bag. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. I asked him what he meant, panic flaring in my chest at the thought of breaking the rules my parents had implicitly set. He turned to me, removing his sunglasses to reveal eyes that were sharp and intelligent. He told me that under no circumstances was I staying alone in that house while my parents were sipping cocktails on a beach. He said it with such absolute authority that the knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. He told me to pack enough for a while. I ran inside, the house feeling more hostile than ever, and threw clothes into my backpack with frantic energy. I grabbed my toothbrush, my favourite book, and the few dollars I had saved in a jar. When I ran back out to the car, Uncle Richard was waiting, the engine running, a sentinel in the gathering dark. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the house. I felt like a refugee fleeing a war zone, unsure of where I was going, but knowing I could never truly return to who I was before. His home was located in a part of the city I had only seen in movies, behind iron gates that swung open slowly to reveal a driveway lined with manicured hedges. The house itself was a sprawling structure of stone and glass, imposing and magnificent. I felt small and dirty as I stepped into the foyer, my sneakers squeaking on the polished marble floor. Everything was pristine, from the vaulted ceilings to the modern art hanging on the walls. Uncle Richard led me to a guest room that was larger than the entire ground floor of my parents' house. The bed was covered in a duvet that looked like a cloud, and the windows overlooked a garden bathed in moonlight. I stood by the door, clutching my backpack, afraid to step on the rug. I whispered that I didn't want to mess anything up. Uncle Richard leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He looked at me with a seriousness that commanded attention, and told me that things in this house existed to be used, not feared. He said that sheets could be washed and rugs could be cleaned, but people needed rest. That first night in the guest room, I lay awake for hours, sinking into the mattress that felt too soft to be real. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to burst in and tell me this was all a mistake, that I belonged back in the dark house with the empty fridge. But the only sound was the central air conditioning humming a low, steady lullaby. I thought about my parents in Florida, about Jasmine and Lily laughing in the pool, and a cold, hard stone formed in my chest. I realized that while they were building memories without me, I was beginning to build a fortress around my heart. Uncle Richard had rescued me from the physical danger of starvation and neglect, but the emotional wilderness I was navigating was vast and uncharted. I fell asleep clutching the pillow, the scent of lavender detergent replacing the smell of stale anxiety, unaware that this was the first night of the rest of my life. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. I wandered into the kitchen, which was bathed in morning sunlight, feeling like an intruder. Uncle Richard was at the stove, wearing a casual sweater and reading a newspaper. He poured me a glass of orange juice, fresh squeezed, not the concentrate we drank at home. I held the glass with both hands, terrified of dropping it. He noticed my hesitation and teased me gently, saying it was just juice, not a binding legal contract. He told me to drink. As I sat there, the phone on the counter buzzed. It was a notification from my mother's social media. Another photo of the three of them at breakfast, smiling over plates of waffles. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them away. Uncle Richard saw where I was looking. He didn't say anything, just placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of me and sat down opposite. He told me that today we were going to get me some things, implying that the contents of my backpack were insufficient for the life he intended for me to lead. We went to a shopping centre that was terrifyingly upscale. I walked a step behind him, keeping my head down, feeling like a stray dog that had wandered into a cathedral. He took me into a clothing store where the fabrics felt like water, and the price tags made my head spin. I tried to steer us toward the clearance rack, but he guided me to the new arrivals. He picked out jeans that actually fit my long legs, and sweaters made of real wool. When we got to the register, I tried to calculate the total in my head, panic rising as the number climbed higher than what my father made in a week. I whispered to Uncle Richard that I couldn't pay him back. He looked at me, handing his card to the cashier without breaking eye contact, and told me that family doesn't keep a ledger. He said it simply, as if it were a universal law, unaware that in my experience, family was nothing but a ledger of debts I could never repay. Back at his house, I tried to make myself invisible again. I folded my new clothes and put them in the drawer, hiding the tags because I was convinced he would change his mind and want to return them. I spent the afternoon in the library, reading books I had only heard about in school. When evening came, I waited in my room, unsure if I was allowed to join him for dinner. He found me there, sitting on the edge of the bed, and asked if I was planning to photosynthesize for sustenance. He led me to the kitchen where he had ordered pizza, a greasy comfort that felt like a bridge between my two worlds. We ate out of the box, and he asked me why my parents had left without me. I told him the truth, that I didn't know, that I was the middle child, the forgettable one. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with every word. When I finished, he told me that being forgettable was a choice others made, not a flaw in my design. He said that from now on, he would make sure I was impossible to ignore. A week passed, and still my parents had not returned. The quote 0 on the sticky note had come and gone. Uncle Richard didn't seem surprised. He enrolled me in the local private school, navigating the bureaucracy with the ease of a man who owned the world. When the administrator asked for my parents' signatures, he produced a document granting him temporary guardianship, something he had arranged with a lawyer while I was sleeping. I watched him sign his name with a flourish, a sharp, angular signature that looked like barbed wire. He told the principal that he would be handling all matters regarding Alma Mountain from this point forward. Walking out of that office, I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a mixture of grief for the family that didn't want me, and a fierce, terrifying gratitude for the man who did. I looked up at him and asked what would happen when they finally came back. He adjusted his cuffs, looked straight ahead, and told me that was a conversation for another day. But I should know that possession is 9/10 of the law, and he had no intention of returning anything he valued. It took 12 days of living in Uncle Richard's guest room before he caught me acting out my survival instincts in his kitchen. I was crouching over a box of sugary cereal at 2 a.m, illuminated only by the ghostly blue light of the open refrigerator, shoving handfuls of dry loops into my mouth as if I expected the food to vanish at sunrise. When the overhead light flicked on, I froze like a startled raccoon, guilt washing over me so intensely that I almost choked. Uncle Richard stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my entire previous wardrobe, looking not angry, but profoundly confused. He asked me quietly if I was rehearsing for a role as a scavenger, or if I was simply hungry. I swallowed hard and admitted in a whisper that I didn't want to take too much during the day, terrified that every calorie I consumed was being tallied on a mental bill I couldn't pay. He didn't lecture me about dietary habits or the time of night. Instead, he walked past me, took a ceramic bowl from the cupboard, filled it with leftover pasta, and heated it until the kitchen smelled of tomato and basil. He slid the bowl across the marble island toward me and said something that dismantled my entire understanding of ownership. He told me that if something is inside this house, it belongs to everyone who lives here, and since I lived there, it belonged to me too. I nodded, fighting back tears that felt too heavy to shed, and ate the pasta, realizing for the first time that safety wasn't just about locks on doors, but about an open fridge and permission to exist. The weeks bled into a month, and the silence from my parents transformed from a temporary gap into a permanent chasm. I kept expecting the front door to rattle with their arrival, for my mother to storm in demanding to know why I wasn't waiting on the porch, but the phone never rang for me. Social media, however, told a different story. Jasmine filled her feed with pictures of her tanned legs and captions about eternal sisterhood, while Lily posed with seashells pressed to her cheek, smiling as if her family was complete. My name never appeared in the comments, and no one tagged me to say they missed me. It was a slow-motion erasure that hurt more than any physical blow. Uncle Richard watched me scroll through these images one evening, his jaw set tight. He didn't offer empty platitudes about them being busy or forgetful. He simply took the phone from my hand, set it face down on the table, and told me that looking at a mirage wouldn't make water appear. He said that some people were incapable of seeing anything that didn't reflect their own image back at them, and unfortunately, I had been born to two such people. It was a harsh truth, but it felt cleaner than the lies I had been telling myself. Uncle Richard began a process he called Quote 1, which I later realised was just his way of parenting without making me feel like a charity case. He took me to a dentist who fixed a cavity I had been hiding for a year, and then to an optometrist who revealed that the reason I sat in the back of the classroom wasn't shyness, but an inability to see the board. When I put on the glasses he bought me, the world sharpened into terrifying clarity. I could see individual leaves on trees and the worry lines etched around my uncle's eyes. He took me to a salon where a stylist cut away the dead, split ends of my hair, leaving me with a sleek bob that made me look older and more serious. Throughout all of this, he never once mentioned the cost. When I tried to thank him, feeling the weight of the debt piling up, he waved me off, saying that keeping things in working order was simply what responsible owners did. It was a joke, but it made me feel valuable, like a classic car worth restoring rather than a rusted sedan left in a junkyard. I started to stand a little straighter, not because I felt confident, but because I felt structurally supported for the first time in my life. At 13, I was still testing the boundaries of this new reality, pushing against the walls to see if they would crumble like my previous life had. One Saturday, I stayed out late with a new friend from school, deliberately forgetting to text because I didn't know what counted as a curfew in a house that wasn't really mine. I walked in around midnight, bracing myself for the explosion of temper that would have greeted me at my parents' house. Uncle Richard was sitting in the living room reading a book, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light. He didn't yell. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a turkey sandwich on a plate. He handed it to me and said he was glad I was alive, but next time I needed to send a text. Otherwise, he would assume I was in a ditch and he would have to go buy a shovel. The evenness of his tone was more disarming than screaming ever could have been. It sounded like care wrapped in structure. I ate the sandwich in my room, realizing that his rules weren't traps designed to catch me failing. They were safety nets designed to catch me if I fell. Not everything was about domestic routine. Uncle Richard believed that education happened primarily outside the classroom. He started bringing me to his office on days when school was out, telling me to sit in the corner and observe how the world actually worked. He was a corporate consultant, a fixer of broken companies, and watching him was like watching a master chess player who knew the opponent's moves before they did. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where he had dismantled a client's excuses with surgical precision, he turned to me and offered a piece of advice that would become my gospel. He told me that half of success is just tone and a firm handshake, and the rest is showing up when everyone else is inventing excuses to stay home. He said that most people walk through life apologizing for their own existence, shrinking to fit into spaces others leave for them. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to never apologize for taking up space. That night, I practiced shaking hands with my bedroom doorknob, trying to channel the absolute certainty I saw in him. The first holiday season under his roof was the moment I truly understood the difference between performance and presence. At my parents' house, Christmas had been a theatrical production involving matching pajamas and staged photos for newsletters, but very little actual warmth. Uncle Richard's version was quieter, smelling of pine and expensive scotch. He didn't buy me a mountain of plastic junk. Instead, he handed me a single heavy box wrapped in dark green paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal with my initials, AAM, pressed into the cover in gold leaf. He told me to write down what I noticed, even the silly things, because memory is a fickle narrator, and ink is the only way to keep the truth straight. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a notification. My parents had posted a photo of themselves, Jasmine and Lily, standing in front of a flawless tree, wearing identical red sweaters. The caption read, "Mountain Family Traditions," with no mention of the missing member. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. Then I opened the journal to the first blank page. I wrote 3 sentences. Things here are meant to be used, not feared. If something is inside this house, it belongs to everyone. I am in this house. The words looked aggressive in my shaky handwriting, but they felt like an anchor. By the time I turned 14, Uncle Richard had decided that my posture was a personal affront to his sensibilities, and that my potential was being wasted on invisibility. He would tap my shoulder whenever I folded inward, telling me to stand tall, because people believe you more when you look like you already believe yourself. I joined the debate club, terrified and shaking, only because he bribed me with the promise of unlimited pizza. My first competition was a disaster of nerves. My voice wobbled like a broken radio, but I managed to argue that cats made superior pets to dogs based on their independence. When the judge announced my win, I looked to the back of the room and saw Uncle Richard grinning, that quiet, smug expression that said he knew something the rest of the room was just figuring out. He wasn't just a guardian, he was a mirror reflecting a version of me I hadn't met yet. When I asked for a new phone to replace my cracked one, he told me it sounded like a great idea and asked how much I had saved. When I admitted I had nothing, he drove me to a local grocery store and waited while I filled out an application for a bagging job. My first paycheck was for exactly $73.16, and I waved it at him like it was a winning lottery ticket. He didn't let me blow it on clothes or gadgets. He drove me to the bank and helped me open an account, establishing a two-part rule that felt draconian at the time, but saved my life later. He said to save half and spend half, so I could enjoy today without robbing tomorrow. I rolled my eyes, typical teenager style, but I deposited the money. Over the next 2 years, that account grew slowly, fed by weekends spent bagging groceries and summers filing papers at his office. Meanwhile, the updates from my biological family became less frequent, appearing like sporadic transmissions from an alien planet. They travelled to Europe, they bought new cars, they celebrated milestones, and I remained a ghost to them. But the sting was fading, replaced by the calluses of hard work and the security of a bank balance that was entirely mine. I was building a foundation of concrete, while they were building castles in the clouds. The summer before my senior year, the contrast between my sisters' lives and mine became sharp enough to draw blood. Jasmine was posting about college acceptance tours, tagging everyone but me, while Lily was showing off a convertible she got for her 16th birthday with the caption, "Thanks, Mum and Dad." I sat at the kitchen table with Uncle Richard, staring at the photo of the car, feeling the old bitterness rise up. Uncle Richard poured 2 mugs of tea and didn't even look up from his tablet. He asked me quietly how long I planned to wait for them to remember me. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He said that they didn't even check in, not a single text on my birthday, and that waiting for them was like waiting for a train at an abandoned station. That night, I stopped following their accounts. I blocked their numbers, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I turned my attention to the stack of college applications in front of me. Uncle Richard sat with me for hours, dissecting financial aid forms and scholarship essays. He told me his help would fill the gaps, but the foundation had to be mine. Move-in day for college was a chaotic symphony of weeping mothers and fathers hauling mini-fridges, a scene that should have triggered my abandonment issues, but instead highlighted how far I had come. My parents didn't send a card. They didn't send a text. Uncle Richard carried my boxes up 3 flights of stairs in the sweltering August heat, his designer shirt sticking to his back, refusing to let me carry the heavy ones. When the room was finally set up, looking sparse but functional, with my thrift store lamp and the quilt from my bed at his house, I felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. I was leaving the sanctuary he had built. He must have sensed my panic because he handed me a small envelope before he left. Inside was a note in his block handwriting that read, "If you ever doubt you belong, check your reflection. You got here without them." I taped it inside my planner, a talisman against the imposter syndrome that threatened to swallow me whole. As I watched his car pull away from the curb, I realised that for the first time in my life, I wasn't being left behind. I was being launched. Those first few months at Western Summit University felt less like a new chapter and more like an extended exercise in imposter syndrome. I walked through the campus quad, clutching my second-hand textbook, feeling like an intruder in a world designed for people who had never worried about the price of milk. My classmates carried designer bags that cost more than my first car and complained about the stress of choosing between spring break destinations in Europe or the Caribbean. I carried a canvas tote that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and spent my evenings calculating how many hours I needed to work at the library help desk to cover my meal plan. But Uncle Richard became my anchor during those drifting weeks. He called every Sunday evening without fail, his voice crackling over the line with a familiarity that settled my nerves. He would tease me, asking if I was still living on ramen noodles and sheer determination, and when I admitted that was exactly my diet, he would chuckle and tell me that struggle was good because it kept the mind sharp. He reminded me that comfort was often the enemy of progress, a philosophy he lived by, and his steady voice became the gravity that kept me from floating away into the ether of my own insecurities. In the spring of my sophomore year, I met Ethan Cole, a marketing major who volunteered at the same community garden where I was fulfilling a service requirement. I was standing ankle-deep in mud, staring at a shovel with profound confusion, when he walked over and gently explained that the pointy end was supposed to go into the ground. I rolled my eyes at his helpfulness, but I let him show me the proper technique. Ethan was different from the boys I'd known in high school. He didn't have that frantic need to prove his masculinity, nor did he treat me like a project that needed saving. We started seeing each other slowly, a relationship built on coffee dates and long walks rather than dramatic declarations. One night, while we were studying for finals, he watched me triple-check the lock on my dorm door and asked gently why I felt the need to verify everything so many times. I hesitated, then told him the truth, that for a long time I had been the mistake nobody bothered to fix, and I was terrified of making one myself. He didn't offer a platitude or try to hug away the trauma. He simply took my hand and said that we would just have to make sure no one ever overlooked me again. It was the first time I felt seen by a peer, not as the abandoned girl, but as someone worthy of being remembered. By my junior year, the ghost of my past insecurities resurfaced in the form of Sabrina, Ethan's ex-girlfriend, who possessed a talent for turning remorse into a spectator sport. She began appearing at campus parties, smiling with a predatory charm and complimenting my thrift store sweaters while her eyes scanned the room for an audience. I tried to ignore her, telling myself I was being paranoid, until she casually mentioned, within earshot of my friends, that Ethan had met her for coffee to help with a business plan. When I confronted Ethan, he admitted it immediately, explaining that she had asked for advice, and he didn't think it was a big deal. The old Alma, the one who waited on porches for people who never came, would have crumbled or apologized for being jealous. But Uncle Richard's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that half the world bluffs and the other half apologizes for existing. I looked Ethan in the eye and told him calmly that I wasn't interested in competing for my own relationship, and the next time she needed advice, she could find someone else's generosity to exploit. He didn't argue or get defensive. He nodded with a look of newfound respect, and that was the end of it. I realized then that I had finally grown a spine strong enough to support my own happiness. Senior year culminated in a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine as I finished my degree in civil engineering, a field Uncle Richard had once described as the art of creating things that endure. On graduation day, the stadium was a sea of black robes and cheering families. I scanned the crowd, knowing my parents wouldn't be there, and for the first time, the realization didn't sting. I didn't need them. In the front row, wearing a suit that looked sharper than the dean's, sat Uncle Richard. When my name was called, he clapped with a ferocity that made people turn and look, a grin splitting his usually stoic face. Afterward, amidst the chaos of flying caps and weeping mothers, he handed me a small rectangular box. Inside was a sleek silver pen, heavy and cool to the touch. He told me to use it to sign the contracts I would be proud of, not my autograph. I laughed and said I wasn't famous yet, and he chuckled, telling me to build first and brag later. That night, while my classmates went out to party, I sat in my dorm room, rereading the journal he had given me at 13. realizing that the house he had promised me wasn't just a building anymore. It was the life I had constructed, brick by brick, with his mortar holding it together. After graduation, I joined a boutique engineering firm in the city. It wasn't a glamorous job. I spent more time looking at drainage plans than skyscrapers, but it was solid, and it was mine. Ethan found a marketing position nearby, and we settled into a rhythm of young adulthood that felt miraculously stable. Every Friday, without exception, Uncle Richard and I met for dinner at his favourite steakhouse. He would lift his glass of whiskey and toast to Miss Mountain, teasing me about scaling the corporate ladder without tripping over my own ambition. I would laugh and banter back, but beneath the warmth of those evenings, I began to notice small, terrifying fractures in his armour. He started rubbing his left shoulder absent-mindedly after lifting his glass. He would pause in the middle of a story, searching for a name that should have been familiar, his brow furrowing in frustration. I told myself it was just age, that even titans like Richard Carlton had to slow down eventually. I didn't want to see the truth because acknowledging it meant accepting that the only parent I had ever truly known was mortal. The decline was subtle, a slow erosion rather than a landslide. Uncle Richard began cancelling our Friday dinners, sending brief texts claiming that work was brutal or that he had a late meeting, excuses I had never heard him use in 6 years. One rainy Tuesday evening, I decided to stop by his house unannounced, carrying a bag of his favourite takeout. I found him asleep in his leather armchair at 8 in the evening, the television murmuring an infomercial to an empty room. He looked smaller somehow, his skin possessing a greyish pallor that the dim light couldn't hide. When I touched his shoulder to wake him, he startled violently, his eyes unfocused for a second before he forced a smile that didn't quite reach them. He blamed a long day and a lack of coffee, but I saw the tremor in his hand as he reached for the water glass on the side table. We spent the evening in a delicate dance of denial, both of us noticing the elephant in the room and both of us refusing to name it. He asked about my job with an intensity that felt urgent, as if he needed to know I was secure before he could let go. Months passed and my career gained traction while his health quietly unravelled. I was promoted to lead a small project, and Ethan and I moved into an apartment that had a dishwasher and actual sunlight. But every time Richard brushed off a cough or needed help standing up from a low chair, my stability cracked a little more. The call that shattered our unspoken pact of silence came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing blueprints. The voice on the other end was Grace, his longtime executive assistant, sounding shaken and small. She told me that Mr. Carlton had collapsed during a board meeting and was being rushed to St. Luke's Hospital. The world tilted on its axis. I don't remember leaving the office or the drive to the hospital. My memory is a smear of red tail lights and the deafening sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. I kept praying to a universe I wasn't sure was listening, begging for it to be a mistake, a false alarm, anything but the beginning of the end. When I finally reached his hospital room, the sight of him stopped me in the doorway. He looked impossibly fragile against the stark white sheets, hooked up to monitors that beeped with a rhythmic indifference to the life they were measuring. But when he turned his head and saw me, that familiar, crooked grin appeared, though it was weaker now. He rasped that I shouldn't look so grim, joking that he had just wanted a free night's stay in a 5-star hotel, even if the room service was terrible. I tried to laugh, but the sound died in my throat, turning into a choked sob. I walked to the bedside and whispered that he had scared me. He shrugged faintly, a gesture that seemed to cost him effort, and said there was a first time for everything. He patted the edge of the bed, inviting me to sit. And for a long time we just sat in the quiet, the machinery breathing for him, the air thick with the things we hadn't said. He waited until the nurse had checked his vitals and left the room before he spoke again, his voice dropping to a serious, gravelly register. He looked at the ceiling and admitted that he always thought my father would be the one to teach me the important things: how to stand tall, how to manage money, how to argue without raising my voice. He said he was glad, in a selfish way, that it turned out to be him. I tried to hush him, telling him not to talk like that, but he squeezed my hand with surprising strength. He told me that I needed to listen because he might not say it again. He looked me straight in the eyes, his gaze piercing through the haze of medication, and told me that I had exceeded every expectation anyone ever had for me. Then he said the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. He told me to remember that I was not the extra piece, that I never had been, and that I was the entire puzzle. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall, knowing he hated displays of pity. He smirked and told me that if I got his sheets wet, I was paying the dry cleaning bill. He was discharged 3 days later, but the man who came home was not the same man who had left. He moved slower, his steps measuring the distance between furniture as if navigating a minefield. We never explicitly discussed the diagnosis, congestive heart failure, a term that sounded too mechanical for a heart that had been so generous, but the shadow of it lived with us. I started spending my weekends at his house, bringing my laptop to work at his kitchen table, while he rested in the living room. We fell into a new routine, one that was quieter and more precious. That final Christmas, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with the knowledge that it was likely our last one together. He handed me a gift wrapped in gold paper, and when I opened it, I found the same leather journal he had given me when I was 13. I looked at him, confused, and he told me to open it. The pages were no longer blank. He had spent years filling the journal. It was a chaotic, beautiful archive of our life together. There were short notes of advice, jokes he had heard and wanted to remember, rough sketches of the garden, and taped-in receipts from our Friday dinners with scribbled reviews of the food. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling, reading entries that spanned a decade. One receipt from a burger joint had a note, quote 5. Another page had a quote about resilience. The very last page made my breath hitch. His handwriting was shaky, the letters less precise than his usual block script, but the message was clear. It read, quote 6. I looked up at him, my throat so tight I could barely speak, and asked if he had been writing in this the whole time. He shrugged, looking pleased with himself, and said he couldn't let me keep all the good lines for myself. I leaned over and hugged him, not the careful, terrified hug of a child afraid to break something, but the fierce embrace of a woman holding on to the only father she had ever known. He chuckled softly, murmuring for me to go easy on his ribs, but he didn't pull away. He held me just as tightly, his hand patting my back in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of pine and old leather, I knew that the transition had begun. He was preparing to leave, and he was making sure that when he did, I wouldn't be left with nothing but a sticky note on a fridge. He was leaving me a manual, a history, and a testament that I had been loved. I drove home that night with the journal on the passenger seat, feeling the weight of it like a physical presence. The city lights blurred past me, and I had the sinking, inevitable realization that the next time the phone rang late at night, it wouldn't be a false alarm. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not empty, but waiting. When the call finally came, it was not with the dramatic crash of thunder or a sudden drop in barometric pressure, but with the mundane buzzing of a phone on a bedside table at 4 a.m. I was already awake, staring at the ceiling as if my body had been tuning itself to a frequency only I could hear, waiting for the signal. I picked up the phone before the second vibration, my hands steady despite the cold dread pooling in my stomach. On the other end, Grace's voice was fractured, stripped of its usual professional polish, and she told me what I already knew before she even said the words. Richard had passed away in his sleep 20 minutes ago. The silence that followed was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. It felt as though someone had walked over to the master breaker of the universe and simply flipped the switch to, quote, 7, draining the colour and sound from the world. I sat on the edge of my bed in the grey pre-dawn light, clutching the phone until my knuckles turned white, staring at a water stain on the wall and waiting for the tears to come. But they didn't. Instead, a profound stillness settled over me, a numbness that I realized later was the only way my mind could survive the immediate amputation of the most important person in my life. He was supposed to be the exception to the rule of loss. He was supposed to be the one thing that stayed. The days that followed dissolved into a blur of logistical necessity, a grey fog where I operated on autopilot. As the executor of his estate, a role he had assigned to me years ago without fanfare, I was the one who had to make the decisions. I found myself sitting in offices that smelled of stale coffee and sympathy, choosing caskets and drafting obituary notices. I knew exactly what he wanted because we had discussed it during those long Friday dinners, usually between jokes about his cholesterol. He wanted simple white roses, not lilies, because he claimed lilies smelled like a funeral parlour, an irony that made me smile through my grief. He wanted his ashes scattered at the coast, not kept in a jar on a mantle to gather dust. I selected the tie for his final rest, a deep navy silk one he called his closing deal tie, and I ironed his shirt myself because I couldn't bear the thought of a stranger touching his things. While I moved through these tasks with a grim efficiency, I felt a strange sense of isolation. I was the keeper of his memory, the curator of his life, and for the first time, I realized that my biological family had no part in this. They were not calling to ask about arrangements. They were not offering to help. They were completely absent, just as they had been for the last 15 years, and I foolishly hoped they would stay that way. The funeral service was held in a small, elegant chapel that Richard had supported for decades. It was a gathering of people who actually knew him, his business partners, his old friends from the club, the staff who had worked for him for 20 years. The air was filled with genuine murmurs of loss and the rustle of respectful silence. I stood near the front, wearing a black dress that felt like armour, nodding through condolences that sounded like they were being spoken underwater. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open with a theatrical creak. Heads turned. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from solemn grief to confused curiosity. Walking down the centre aisle, as if they were arriving late to a movie premiere, were my parents, Jasmine, and Lily. My mother was wearing oversized black sunglasses that covered half her face, a dramatic affectation for a woman who hadn't seen the deceased in a decade and a half. My father walked with a practiced solemnity, shaking hands with strangers as he passed, acting the part of the grieving brother. Jasmine and Lily trailed behind, dressed in fashionable black outfits that looked like they had been purchased specifically for Instagram content. They didn't look sad. They looked like they were scouting a location. They waited until the service was over, until the crowd had thinned and I was standing alone by the portrait of Richard near the altar, before they made their move. They approached me as a unit, a phalanx of shared DNA and zero shared history. My mother reached out and clutched my hand with a damp, frantic grip, her voice trembling with a performance-ready vibrato. She gasped my name and said they had no idea Richard and I were so close, implying that my relationship with him was a secret I had kept, rather than a life they had ignored. I pulled my hand away gently but firmly, feeling a wave of revulsion. I looked her in the eye and told her quietly that she would have known if she had ever asked. My father cleared his throat, stepping in to salvage the scene, slipping into the deep, resonant tone he used for Toastmasters and business negotiations. He said that my uncle was an extraordinary man, a pillar of the family, and a generous soul. The word, quote, 9 coming from his mouth felt like a violation. Jasmine chimed in then, her voice sugar-coated but her eyes darting around the room, assessing the wealth of the attendees. She asked if I knew when the will reading was scheduled, adding quickly that Uncle Richard was obviously very comfortable and she hoped he had kept the family legacy in mind. It took every ounce of discipline Richard had instilled in me not to scream. Standing there, just feet away from his urn, they were already circling like vultures catching the scent of a carcass. Lily, adjusting her pearl earrings, let out an exaggerated sigh and whispered that she just hoped he wanted them to keep the assets together, mentioning the house and the cars specifically. For a second, I wondered if I was trapped in a hallucination. He hadn't even been dead for 48 hours, and they were already mentally dividing up his property. I didn't bother to argue or explain. I simply looked at them with the cold detachment of a stranger. I told them that now was not the time. My father's face flushed slightly, a crack in his benevolent mask, but he nodded, assuming that his authority would eventually prevail. I turned my back on them and walked out of the chapel into the blinding sunlight, leaving them standing there with their calculations and their false grief. I drove home shaking, not from sorrow, but from a rage so pure it felt like it could burn down a city. In the week that followed, the silence from my family was replaced by a deluge of digital affection. My phone, which had been dormant of their attention for years, suddenly lit up with texts, voicemails, and social media notifications. My mother sent long, rambling messages about how much she missed me and how we really needed to reconnect because family is all we have in the end. It was transparent and nauseating. Jasmine slid into my direct messages with a sudden interest in my life, asking to meet for coffee to, quote, 10, followed immediately by a casual inquiry about estate lawyers. Lily posted a throwback photo of her and Richard from when she was 5, likely the last time she saw him, captioned with a broken heart emoji and a quote about loss. They were rewriting history in real time, positioning themselves as the bereaved relatives, preparing the narrative for their payday. I didn't respond to a single message. I let them pile up, a digital monument to their greed. I spent my evenings in Richard's study, surrounded by his books and the smell of his pipe tobacco, reading the journal he left me, drawing strength from his handwriting. 10 days after the funeral, the call I had been expecting finally came. It was Mr. Halpern, Richard's attorney and oldest friend, a man whose voice sounded like gravel crunching under tyres. He was all business, but there was a hint of something else in his tone. Anticipation, perhaps. He informed me that the will reading was scheduled for Monday morning at 10 o'clock sharp. He told me that he had contacted my parents and sisters as well, per Richard's specific instructions. When I asked him what to expect, he paused for a long moment. He told me that the reading might be, quote, 11, quote, and that my uncle was a man who believed in closing loops. He didn't give away the details, but he advised me to come prepared. I hung up the phone and looked at the calendar. Monday, the day of reckoning. I realised then that Richard hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a final lesson in justice. He knew exactly who they were, and he had set the stage for one last masterclass in how to handle people who only value you for what you can give them. The morning of the reading, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but the rage had crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. I dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. I chose a black dress, simple and severe, with no jewellery except for the small silver bracelet with the initial quote, 12 that Richard had given me for my high school graduation. I pulled my hair back, revealing my face, refusing to hide. I didn't wear the expensive watch he had bought me, or carry the designer bag. I didn't need to display wealth to know my worth. Before I left the house, I went to the study and picked up the leather journal. I ran my fingers over the gold lettering, tracing the scars in the leather. I opened it to the last page and reread his final message. Quote 13. I slipped the journal into my bag. It was my shield. I walked out to my car, the same sensible sedan I had driven for years, and headed toward the city. I wasn't going there to fight for money. I was going there to witness the truth. Mr. Halpern's law office was located in a building that screamed old money and intimidation. The lobby was all marble and hushed tones. The elevator rose with a silent swiftness that made my ears pop. When the doors opened on the top floor, the smell of lemon polish and expensive leather hit me, the scent of judgment. I walked into the conference room and found them already there. My parents, Jasmine and Lily, were seated on one side of the long mahogany table, looking like a tribunal. They had dressed for the occasion. My mother was wearing pearls, my father a suit that was slightly too tight, and my sisters were in outfits that straddled the line between funeral chic and boardroom aggressive. When I entered, 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. There was no warmth in their gaze, only assessment. They were sizing me up, wondering if I was going to be a problem, wondering how big of a slice of the pie I expected. I didn't say a word. I pulled out the heavy chair at the head of the table, opposite Mr. Halpern's empty seat, and sat down. I placed the journal on the table in front of me, closed my hands over it, and waited. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, making a show of her sorrow for an audience of none. Jasmine was tapping her manicured nails on the table, a staccato rhythm of impatience. Lily leaned over to whisper something to my father, who nodded solemnly, his eyes fixed on the door where the lawyer would enter. They looked confident, assured of their place in the natural order of things. After all, they were the, quote, 14 family, the blood relatives, the ones whose names were on the birth certificates. I was just the stray that Richard had taken in, the charity case. They had convinced themselves that biology trumped 15 years of absence. The door handle turned with a sharp click, and Mr. Halpern entered the room carrying a thick file folder. He looked at me and offered a barely perceptible nod, then turned his gaze to my family with a look that was entirely unreadable. He sat down, placed the folder on the table, and adjusted his glasses. The room went deathly silent. My father leaned forward, a predator ready to feast. Mr. Halpern cleared his throat, opened the file, and began to speak. Mr. Halpern began reading with a voice that was dry and devoid of emotion, a tone that suggested he had seen every variation of human greed and disappointment that a mahogany table could witness. He started with the standard administrative details, the settling of outstanding debts, and the small, specific bequests to charities that Richard had supported quietly for years. There was a donation to the local library, a fund for the maintenance of the community garden where I had met Ethan, and generous severance packages for his housekeeper and gardener, ensuring they could retire comfortably. My family shifted in their seats during this preamble, their impatience radiating off them like heat waves from asphalt. Jasmine checked her watch twice, and my father tapped his foot in a rhythm that betrayed his desperate desire to get to the bottom line. They didn't care about the staff or the charities. They viewed every dollar mentioned as a personal theft from the fortune they believed was rightfully theirs. They were tolerating the appetizers only because they were convinced the main course would be a feast. I watched them, feeling a strange kind of pity mixed with disgust. They had no idea that the man they were waiting to inherit from had spent the last decade carefully documenting their absence, ensuring that his final act would be a mirror reflecting their own neglect back at them. Then Mr. Halpern turned a page, the paper rustling loudly in the silent room, and adjusted his glasses. He announced that he would now address the remainder of the estate and the distribution of assets to the immediate family. My mother straightened up, smoothing her skirt, a small, triumphant smile already playing on her lips. Lily leaned forward, eyes wide and hungry. Mr. Halpern read slowly, enunciating every syllable to ensure there was no room for misinterpretation. He stated that regarding the estranged relatives, specifically named as his brother, sister-in-law, and 2 nieces, Jasmine and Lily, Richard had left a very specific directive. The will read that to the family members who had remembered his existence only when his bank balance suited their needs, and who had treated a 13-year-old child as disposable cargo, he left absolutely nothing. The silence that followed was not merely quiet, it was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. It was the sound of a collective intake of breath that had nowhere to go. My mother gasped, a sharp, strangled sound, while Jasmine's mouth fell open in a caricature of shock. Lily blinked rapidly, looking from the lawyer to her father, whispering in a stunned voice that he had to be joking. Mr. Halpern did not look up, nor did he acknowledge their disbelief. He simply turned to the final section of the document. He read that to his niece, Alma Mountain, who had been abandoned at 13, but had never been absent since. Richard left the entirety of his estate. This included the primary residence, the vacation property, his investment portfolio, all personal effects, and the entirety of his savings. The list of assets went on, detailing holdings and accounts that even I hadn't fully known the extent of, totaling a sum that was staggering. For one suspended moment, the room was frozen in a tableau of contrasting fortunes. I sat perfectly still, my hand resting on the leather journal, feeling not a rush of joy, but a profound sense of validation. It wasn't about the money. It was Richard's final way of saying that I was the one who counted. Then the paralysis broke. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto me with a mixture of venom and disbelief. Jasmine was the first to shatter the decorum, her voice rising to a shrill pitch as she slammed her hand on the table. She shouted that it was impossible, that Richard barely knew me, and that I must have forged something or tricked him. My father's face had turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at me across the table, his voice trembling with a rage that I suspected was fueled more by financial panic than familial betrayal. He accused me of manipulating a sick old man, of poisoning Richard's mind against his own flesh and blood during those years I was living with him. He claimed that I had stolen their inheritance and that I was a thief. The irony of his accusation was so thick I could taste it. I kept my tone steady, channeling every ounce of the composure Richard had taught me during our years together. I looked my father in the eye and told him calmly that I hadn't poisoned anyone. I said that he had done the work himself the day he left a 13-year-old girl alone in a house with a sticky note on the fridge and never looked back. I reminded him that Richard had known me for 15 years, day in and day out, while they hadn't bothered to make a single phone call until they thought there was a check to be collected. I told them that they weren't victims of a manipulation, they were victims of their own indifference. Lily tried a different tactic, her eyes filling with tears that looked practiced and strategic. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a wheedling, pleading tone. She asked me if I was really planning to keep everything for myself, invoking the sacred bond of sisterhood that she had ignored for my entire adolescence. She said that we were family, and family is supposed to share. That word again, family. It hung in the air, twisted and distorted by their greed. I let out a slow breath and smiled, an expression that held no warmth, only a weary finality. I told her it was funny how 15 years of silence didn't sound much like family, but the moment there was money on the table, suddenly we were related again. I said that family isn't a word you use to open a bank vault. It's the people who show up when you have nothing to offer them. Mr. Halpern closed the folder with a definitive snap that sounded like a gavel striking a block. He informed them that the will was airtight, drafted when Mr. Carlton was of sound mind and body, and that any attempt to contest it would be met with an aggressive countersuit that would likely drain whatever resources they currently had. He advised them to accept the reality and leave. My mother looked as though she wanted to scream, her face contorted into a mask of ugly entitlement, but the mention of legal fees silenced her. The disbelief on their faces curdled into a bitter, impotent anger. They looked at me with the same expression they had worn years ago when they realised I was an inconvenience to their vacation plans. Only now, I was the one holding the keys, and they were the ones being left behind. I smoothed the front of my black dress and stood up, my movements deliberate and calm. I told them that if they would excuse me, I had things to take care of. I thanked Mr. Halpern for his time and his loyalty to my uncle. Jasmine hissed at me as I turned to leave, promising that this wasn't over. I paused at the door, met her gaze evenly, and told her that it was over the moment she stopped calling me her sister and started treating me like a stranger. I walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving them to argue with a lawyer who had no patience for their theatrics and no sympathy for their loss. Stepping out of the building and onto the sidewalk, the air felt sharper, cleaner, as if the world had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. The city noise washed over me, honking taxis, distant jackhammers, the murmur of pedestrians, and it sounded like a symphony of freedom. The sunlight bounced off the glass facades of the skyscrapers, momentarily blinding me, and in that flash of white light, I saw myself clearly. I wasn't the scared 13-year-old girl waiting on a porch for a rescue that never came. I wasn't the poor relation grateful for scraps of attention. I was Alma Mountain, a woman who had been built by love, not blood, and who was standing on her own ground. I pulled my phone from my bag and opened my messages, scrolling past the desperate texts from my family that I would never answer. I found the contact for Uncle Richard, which I hadn't been able to bring myself to delete. I typed a message that I knew would never be delivered, but needed to be sent. I wrote that I wished he could have seen their faces, and that he was right about everything. I told him that I had written my own chapter. I hit send, watching the message bubble float into the ether, a final update for the man who had saved my life. Later that week, I stood on the balcony of Richard's house, my house now, watching the city lights shimmer below like a vast electric ocean. The evening was cool, and I wrapped his old cardigan around my shoulders, taking comfort in the faint scent of tobacco and cedar that still clung to the wool. I held the leather journal in my hands, flipping to the final page once more. The ink was beginning to fade slightly, but the words still burned with the intensity of a command. If they ever try to erase you again, remember this. You have already written your own chapter. I traced the letters with my fingertip, smiling into the darkness. I whispered to the night air that I did, and that I would keep writing. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the millions of dollars in the bank, or the properties, or the portfolio. I was thinking about the 13-year-old girl who had eaten dry cereal in the dark, wondering what she had done wrong to be forgotten. If I could reach back through time to her now, I would tell her that one day she would have a home that didn't treat her like a visitor, a life that never apologized for taking up space, and a name that no one would ever overlook again. Ethan stepped out onto the balcony behind me, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He didn't say anything at first, just wrapped an arm around my shoulders and pulled me close, offering his warmth against the night chill. He asked softly if I was okay. I leaned into him, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against my back. I nodded and told him that I was more than okay. I felt like the circle was finally closed. He looked out at the skyline, the lights reflecting in his eyes, and said that Richard would be proud of how I handled everything. I tilted my face toward the vast, starless sky above the city glow. I told him that I thought Richard already was. Below us, the city continued its restless movement, a million stories being written at once. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's narrative. I was the author, the protagonist, and the editor of my own life. My family had tried to edit me out, to leave me on the cutting room floor, but they had failed. I was still here. I was the story. And as I took a sip of tea and looked out over the world that was now mine to navigate, I knew that the best chapters were still waiting to be written.